We're going to do a two-part series on a pretty essential question in our field, which is, what is alcoholism? What is addiction? And in fact, we're going to go back, peel it back even further, and we're going to ask, is there alcoholism? Is there addiction? And we're going to try and illustrate it with some specific examples, one that's very much in the news, because there's a, I think, Netflix series about Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman, the last movie stars. So let me just throw some impossible questions at you, Zach, to start. Do you believe in alcoholism?
I know the term is avoided now, but if you're talking about being addicted to alcohol, I think we can just call it that. Yeah, of course. Of course, I think that people can be addicted to alcohol.
And to drugs. So I would say that people are not so against alcoholism and against addiction as they're very much against the terms alcoholic and addict. Do you agree? Do you see that the same way?
Sure.
How come? Why are people down on those terms? I think we have a specific answer for that.
I think some people don't like the idea of downgrading a person to some moralistic standard, which they think alcoholism addict does. I think some people, and we would fall into this camp, don't like the idea of putting a label on somebody as though it defines their existence. And so everywhere in between.
And I think the thing that we add on to that is, putting a label on something which a person may strive to define themselves by, but we don't believe alcoholism and addiction are permanent. And so therefore, we wouldn't call people alcoholics or addicts like that's them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to, everybody is talking about Paul Newman's, at the same time, they're calling him the last movie star, and his wife, Joanne Woodward. All of the commentaries in the documentary call him an alcoholic. And we're just going to puzzle around that. But before doing that, I want to dig into the historical files. There used to be something called the Bulletin of the Society of Psychologists and Addictive Behaviors, and it used to be kind of mimeographed and then Xeroxed out to, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred people. And I wrote something in 1986 called The Life Study of Alcoholism, putting drunkenness in biographical context. Well, James Boswell wrote the biography of Samuel Johnson.
Okay.
And Samuel Johnson wrote the first dictionary out of his head, and he was sort of considered like a genius. And James Boswell spent several decades writing his biography. And a man named Frank Brady wrote a biography of Boswell, which I read. And Brady goes to some lengths to say that Boswell was not an alcoholic. And here's one of the ways he put it was, my task is understanding the role of Boswell's drinking as part of Boswell's psychic economy, instead of making the common but unfortunate mistake of taking drinking as a cause célèbre by itself.
Right.
So these are quotes from Brady. He tended to get drunk quickly and then stay at the same level of intoxication for some time. If he went on for too long, he either lost all control or blacked out. Aware that he was using liquor more and more as a release from his boredom with his daily life, Boswell reacted by swearing reform and reprobating his conduct in his journal. kind of sounds like what we would call alcoholism, isn't it? The part where he drank for days at a time, blacking out and losing all control.
Yeah, especially because he wrote about it in a negative way in his journal. I mean, I think that's actually the key.
In other words, it was kind of, he was distressed by it. One of the DSM criteria is trying to change your behavior and failing.
Right. It's hard to imagine that drinking days on end and blacking out could lead to something fruitful on a loop. So we could kind of make an assumption there, but right, I think it sticks when it says that he claims to have been in distress.
And I'm getting back to Brady, the biographer, who everybody, he's probably dead by now. He was considered, one of the great biographers. The serious problem of Boswell's conduct created for him was that it tended to set up a vicious cycle. Loose living eroded his self-esteem, always equality in short supply. Meaning Boswell had a lot of doubts about himself.
Mm-hmm.
And the lower his self-esteem sank, the more recourse he had to drinking and whoring. So that's the kind of a cycle that you and I are aware of, where, as you described it, a person's view of themselves takes a tumble and then they return to the addiction.
And it sounds like it was feeding on itself as well.
Right. Now, after all of that, Brady actually takes the trouble to say, but Boswell was not an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did Brady's a smart man, and he was writing 1980s, and I contrast his view to George Vaillant's book, which came out at exactly the same time as Boswell's book, The Natural History of Alcoholism, which was one of the forerunners of the modern disease theory. And what Brady says, Boswell was to cap his own literary career with his life of Samuel Johnson. That's the title of it. Quote, by common consent, the greatest biography ever written. So I just want to pause for a second. When you've written a book and everybody in the world says that's the greatest biography ever written, And Boswell only completed this work late in life after his father's and his wife's deaths, and after Johnson's death, and after moving permanently to England. So he spent a lot of time with Johnson, and a lot of this life of Samuel Johnson is like, oh, we were at a party, blah, 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 blah. Everybody said this, and Johnson said this. The life of Samuel Johnson only became famous 100 years after it was written. And originally, people thought, well, all he did was write down what Samuel Johnson said. But it slowly dawned on people, you don't go to a party with a bunch of geniuses, where everybody's drinking until dawn, and you just take notes. What I mean?
Yeah.
You go home and you shape the material. You don't write the greatest work of all time on a tape recorder.
Right.
And so finally, we're back to Brady. Sober and chaste, although Boswell might have had less to apologize for to his wife and others, quote, he would have paid a high price in depression and might well have lacked the vitality to write The Life of Johnson. What kind of a label would we apply to that analysis? Or how do we see what that statement Brady made? How would we interpret that statement?
He used that as a utility. He used alcohol as a utility. It opened up a creative sort of node.
And it calls to, Bruce Alexander had the concept of an adaptive use of drugs, which is, people are using things for a reason. And that reason is essential to who they are. And it may cause problems, but, you don't just pull it out and expect the whole house of cards to stand. And another thing about it, I think that fits into our concept of harm reduction. Our concept of harm reduction says we don't count up how many drinks you had.
Mhm.
We don't even count totally how many negative events you had. We count up, are you a successful, functioning, living human being?
It sounds like, too, just to open up another thread, which maybe we don't need, but it sounds like there was some distress already.
Right.
In other words, that's another way of saying that the alcohol enhanced things. But if that's an argument for somebody not being an alcoholic, it maybe the cycle itself had some element of distress to it. And so maybe we would say that's, but there's something that, yeah.
It's kind of a philosophical discussion. Well, maybe he was so depressed that he drank so much, he looked like an alcoholic. You know what I mean? But isn't that just another description of alcoholism? But Brady's not going there. He's saying, well, look at this human being. This is how he functioned.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go over to Paul Newman. Do you have any gut reaction to everybody calling Paul Newman an alcoholic now? He's dead.
Yeah. Well, I would never have thought of him as one. I mean, I've read some articles about this, but I never would have thought of him as one, given that he was successful, he was philanthropic, he was a great actor. He seemed to have decent relationships, although now I know that they were a struggle at times after reading some parts of the biography. But it does sound like his drinking, although it was part of some successful life. I mean, they talked about he would drink a case of beer a night. And I was thinking, right, when I read that, I thought, okay, so you're giving me a number, but that doesn't say anything. And then he would wake up in the morning and splash cold water on his face so that he would have a productive day. So it sounded like he was using it for something, except that there were a lot of times he was blacking out and then failed to honor commitments with his children, or wasn't there for his kids. That area I don't know about, but that's something I've read. So if that area could be something like an alcohol addiction.
So what you're saying is that's what you would want to examine.
Yes.
Did he black out and was he unreliable? And here's the counter evidence. I just put this up, I guess, from Wikipedia. He's the only actor to be nominated for Academy Awards in 5 decades.
Yeah, he's very successful.
1959, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. 1962, The Hustler. 1968, Cool Hand Luke. My favorite, 1983, The Verdict, because he starts out being an out-of-control alcoholic, and then he wins a giant case, and he stops being an alcoholic. That's my favorite. 1995, Nobody's Fool. 2003, The Road to Perdition. Now I'm just reading. Newman won several national championships as a driver in Sports Car Club of America road racing, and his race teams won several championships. He was a co-founder of Newman's Own, a food company, which he donated all post-tax profits and royalties to charity. As of May 2021, those donations totaled over $570 million. So I want to point out something else. The charities, Paul Newman felt that he should do good things and help people. God bless his soul. In 1988, Newman founded the Serious Fun Children's Network, a global family of summer camps and programs for children with serious illnesses. And he also co-founded Safe Water Network with John Whitehead, access to safe water to underserved communities. That's a kind of a brainy one. Do you know what I mean? Casual people don't figure out, oh, people need water. He was married twice and he fathered 6 children. He was married for 50 years to Joanne Woodward. And so there's some quotes from his first marriage. He had a son who died around drugs, which he was guilty about forever. If you want to talk about, Boswell wrote The Life of Johnson, and he behaved the way he did because, drinking a lot because he was depressed. That was something on Paul Newman's mind that he never escaped. On the other hand, he stayed married to a famous woman for 50 years. They had a productive relationship. And I should finally add, he lived to be 83, and he was good looking and healthy. Are we willing to call somebody like that an alcoholic? That's the question.
Maybe not a priori, but I could imagine that there were times during his life where he could have sought somebody like a therapist or somebody to talk to and said, what should I do here? It seems like my wife is pissed off at me. My kids feel like I'm absent. What could I do to wrangle this thing in? And it wouldn't have to involve completely stopping drinking or something like that. So not that idea of an alcoholic, but somewhere down the line, it sounds like but the process ebbed and flowed, and it was better and worse.
And, it fits into the life process program model, because we don't label people alcoholics. We sort of don't even answer the question if they say, oh, am I an alcoholic? We don't say that. We say what you just said. If you run into some problems around your drinking, what are those? How do you think we can unwind them? And at the same time, we say, like, we wouldn't tell James Boswell to stop drinking, or Paul Newman. We can't undo what happened with his oldest son.
Right.
We don't blame him, but we don't tell people, oh, whatever you get from alcohol doesn't count. We don't tell them.
Exactly. We'd go the other direction with it, as you're sort of laying out. Geez, man, you seem to be more successful than anybody I know. What the hell got you here? And he might say that an alcohol regimen in the evening is part of it. Maybe he would also say, still, I'm drinking enough that I'm losing some control. And so that's the space as a clinically speaking, that's the space you would want to explore with him. How do you keep up being so successful, basically happy, but, work out those things along the way that you think are distressing you?
So an example that comes up, like I'll consult on a marital case. And so one thing that'll happen is a person will say, well, I won't drink when I have custody, when I'm doing custody of the child.
Right.
But I'll drink other times. And a second thing that you're pointing out that's very important to the Life Process program is Paul Newman is a positive, accomplished person who tries to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's spending all his time doing that food thing to donate all the money to charity and trying to get clean water, in Africa. I mean, he wants to do the right thing. And so you've got a person who's basically value driven in a positive, pro-social way. So we're on the same page with him. What you just said was, what are you trying to do in life? You're trying to have good relationships. And he was, like Boswell was popular. People like to drink with Boswell. People like to know Paul Newman. So we've got all of those positives to build off of, where we're saying, well, you want to do positive things for people and your family. Can we fine tune how well you're doing? You're doing beyond belief. Can we fine tune how you're doing those things?
Right. A utilitarian might say, well, that's good that he's ignoring his family, or else he wouldn't get all those accomplishments done, doing the greater good for as many people. I think Paul Newman, I'm sure parts of his life, I haven't read the biography yet, but I'm sure parts of his life said, I still want to do a great good for as many people as I can.
By the way, there's Brady's biography of Boswell, but right now on Netflix, there's the
documentary. That's what I mean.
Bio, whatever they call it.
Right. But I think Paul Newman himself would have said, I still want to be doing a great good for as many people as I can, and especially my family and my children. So, how do I work that into it?
He tried to combine a solid marriage with some behavior that most people would count as not the way to go in a marriage. And as I said, from the first marriage, he had a child who died. You and I experience people who've had children who die around substances. You can't wish it away. It's something that's a part of their makeup.
Yeah.
So, you haven't watched the whole documentary. You don't know all about Paul Newman's love. Well, I don't think you would call Paul Newman an alcoholic.
Well, I wouldn't call anybody an alcoholic, but I certainly, if there's a word, but if there's a term that I would use to describe his life, that wouldn't enter that theater of my imagination or my mind. I wouldn't say the alcohol thing is the thing that defined him. I would say everyone has their problems, and he seems like he had some problems around alcohol at some point. So
I would summarize by saying we began by saying we don't call anybody an alcoholic. So It's a no-brainer that we wouldn't call Paul Newman an alcoholic. But that's not how you would view him. Just the same way we're going back to the biography by Brady of James Boswell. He doesn't look at James Boswell and think, oh, alcoholic. He looks at James Boswell and he thinks about the creative, monumental force who was living his life out with issues. And he eventually came to a great success and conclusion. And let's end this part of our dealing with alcoholism and addiction by saying that's the best clinical approach.
Brilliantly done.
We're not labeling is useless. Identifying how a person is maybe shortchanging themselves as being all possibly they best could be without judging them, certainly without putting them down. And, why would Paul Newman not go to AA? You could give some answers. He doesn't want to call himself an alcoholic. He doesn't want to have that image in the United States of America. That's his right, And we're saying, fine. You don't have to do that. That's not what this is all about. Any final summary on the Paul Newman, James Boswell riff?
No, you did. That was really good. The whole Boswell riff I didn't expect. So that was a good segue into the deeper conversation, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Stanton.
Excellent. We'll see you again soon then.